The ninth commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. And the thing at issue here is deceit. So deceit in daily life when you're talking to other people, and then as particularly deceit in court, so basically defrauding justice. Now, when we're coming at things from the Marxist perspective, we've obviously got the Gnostic understanding of reality, which is embedded. So you've got the material world. It's essentially been falsely apprehended and replaced with, philosophical and religious abstractions. This is keeping us separated from our materiality, material conception being reflected in consciousness, and then this is associated with all of the horrendous oppression that the Marxist system states is the case, is the system that we're living under. Now, ultimately, once you come at it from that perspective, you can see how this cascades back into the rest of the commandments that we've already analysed. So if we're looking at the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, who took you out of the land of Egypt and freed you from bondage, then ultimately, yes, there is no God that's going to take you out of the oppression of Pharaoh. You must free, humanity must free itself, first from belief in God, and then secondly from whatever kind of material oppression is taking place. And then the second commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me and make no graven image. Well, there again, if you're coming at it from the inverse, God would be, or any kind of image or depiction of Christ, for example, or icon, would be deemed an image that's being placed before the pantheist species being. And this would need to be destroyed because that turns out to be a deceit. And then lastly, of course, we've got probably the most important and most direct one, which is not taking the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So, of course, every kind of moral and good and decent upright action under the Judeo-Christian tradition would then be seen as rooted in deceit and the maintenance of alienated consciousness, alienated from your socialism, so awareness of your own divine aspect, but then also sustaining material estrangement, so the non-possession of or not failing to recognize that the material world is likewise integrated and part of yourself. So that's where it connects back into the socialism aspect. Okay, so here it's, you shall not bear false witness against the species being, and then brackets, including the praxis of revolutionary intellectuals affected by the party. So the idea is that it's connected ultimately to the third commandment, because everything is seen through the lens of deceit. So the problem is that you've got to overturn all of the other deceits, but ultimately it's of the same form. It's just from a backward position. Marx states that his whole life long he fought against the illusion of gravity, of whose harmful consequences all statistics brought him new and manifold evidence. This valiant fellow was the type of new revolutionary philosophers in Germany. So speaking essentially of himself, of Engels, and the other people who join his movement, the attempt is to strive against the former deceits, such as the illusion of gravity, and to thereby, having, in theory, overcome the illusion of gravity, to implement it in the real world. So consciousness can fundamentally reform the nature of reality itself. You can maybe make a comment about whether Marx genuinely believes that, and whether that's absolutely what's being intended under the system of communism and dialectical materialism. But it certainly reflects the severity and the degree and the depth of the revolution. So ultimately, Lenin will then also state that social being determines their consciousness. So you've got this kind of idea of the wider milieu, nature, being, whatever you want to call it. This has an impact, an effect, is reflected in the human. The relation between the two is reflected in their consciousness. So the way in which we interact with nature is reflected in our consciousness. It's part of our social being, yada, yada, yada. It should be quite clear by now. So one of the key things which flows from Marx's logic and apprehension of reality, because he stated that his system was to be a new logic, then all of the forms of logic, philosophical ontology, epistemology, axiology, morality and ethics, and aesthetics all need to be dialectically reformed, because they're all, as prior to Marx, in their inverse. They're only a reflection which reveals that those things exist in a material form, but previously they've been comprehended through philosophy. Now they need to be comprehended and acted out, embodied materially. So formal logic becomes dialectical logic. Ontology under the Christian system rejects creation for generation, rejects God for the pantheist monad. Epistemology is not, for example, in rationalism and things like this, deduced down from taking God as a creator and then working everything out down the way. Is instead, epistemology is entirely inductive. So you're saying that you've got your material relation to the world and social relations around you, and these are reflected up into consciousness. Ultimately, however, because you are not free to really think from yourself, the inductive aspect is completely collared. You're only allowed to think in certain ways, speak in certain ways, conduct yourself in certain ways. There's a certain model in which information is meant to come into you. You're meant to have certain senses. So essentially everything about you is already to be like pre-crafted and put into this little box. And it's only by feeding very specific information in a specific way into specific receptacles, and then processing them in a certain way, and then producing certain kinds of outputs, which all are likewise guided by certain principles, that you then have something approaching epistemology. But ultimately it's forming everything through the system of logic, which is defined by Marx, with all of the caveats of the way of nature and what's moral and what's not, and so on and so forth. So the axiology, the way in which people make value judgments, these are of course changed if you're going to fundamentally alter the form of logic itself and the knowledge with which people make decisions, because different objects will then obtain a different moral value. That's why, for example, private property is seen as so evil, is because it's connected with the problem of human sacrifice. And then that's overturned by taking part in a new sacrifice, which then of sacrifice of other people, which likewise then generates the species being. And of course that is what's the moral action, and it's the thing which is beautiful. All of these things tied together dialectically. So all of those above 6 categories, they lead to a certain relationship to nature that's reflected in consciousness. It's wrong. It's linked to the old system of society. Ideology, their governing philosophy, which sustains the class oppression between the different groups. And of course, the main job of the proletariat or the subaltern after Gramsci is to overthrow that. So from the dialectical materialist perspective, you've got a system which is rooted and sustains the old form of consciousness, and then you need to ultimately overthrow them. The greatest deceit that you could probably do is likewise an inversion of the one that in the Commandment. So if you were to make an oath to tell the truth sworn on the Bible, that would be seen as one of the highest manifestations of maintaining deceit from the Marxist perspective. So of course, once you've got this idea that from humanity all morality is issued and can be refashioned as desired, then ultimately, the truth is going to have to be dialectical as well, because every aspect of reality needs to be reformed. So that comes from the consciousness of the society, most often represented by the consciousness of the intellectuals. So they write out the Apocrypha, they do the intellectual labor, they generate the theories, which are then communicated widely through propaganda, which the rest of the revolutionary society must put into practice. So first the intellectuals come up with it, create their ideas, they do the actual work, so they put it on paper. Through other people seeing it, the theory is communicated to other people's consciousness, so it's reflected back into their consciousness, and then they are then tasked with implementing it and further spreading it. So it spreads like a chain throughout. It's kind of like a virus overtaking and moving in people's minds, but which they all harmonize and then put it into action. So yes. in Soviet Russia, incidentally, the main newspaper issued by the party was called Pravda, and Pravda is the Soviet word for truth. Okay, so Mao, when speaking of counter-revolutionaries, stated that they owed blood debts. So the blood debt, this facilitates the violation of the commandment to murder, because the other people, the bourgeois, they are accused of already having partaken in the system of human sacrifice, so they owe blood debts. They've accrued blood debts by sacrificing other people. So now you need to invert that. You need to do the antithetical. And so justice ultimately is tied towards the calling in of the blood debt. In Lenin, you see this stated in its more positive aspect, saying that the courts have to enact revolutionary righteousness, so their purpose is ultimately the revolution. And that's also why, and that's also associated with the fact that Lenin states that terror is the means to settle accounts. Okay, and these once again are the sources. So I hope you've enjoyed the video again, and thank you.